네, 그럼 지금부터
Now we will begin the session on the role of Northeast Asia's maritime logistics in the post-COVID-19 era of global supply chain restructuring. Actually, we had scheduled an opening speech by the president of KMI, Mr. Jang Young-tae, but he had to attend a session at the National Assembly, so we will go straight into the session. Let me introduce the moderator for this session, KMI Vice President of Research, Mr. Kim Jong-deog. And as discussants, we have Mr. Kim Kye-hwan, who is the Executive Director of the Center for International Industry and Trade, and Mr. Park Ho-Chul, Vice President for Global Business Busan Port Authority, and Mr. Professor Sang-joon of Kookmin University, and last but not least, Mr. Sung-woo, General Policy Research Division Deputy President of KMI. And we will also have with us Mr. Kawai Masahiro, who will be joining us online. She is the Representative Director and Director General, Economic Research Institute for Northeast Asia, ERINA. And currently, he is also teaching at the Tokyo University. And before we have the panel discussion, we will invite Mr. Jean-Paul Rodrigue of the Hofstra University to give a keynote speech. He is a world-renowned authority on transport geography, so let's listen to his keynote speech first.
I'm a professor at the Department of Global Studies and Geography at Hofstra University in New York. And first of all, I would like to thank the organizers to give me this opportunity to give, unfortunately, a remote presentation about the role and prospects of maritime logistics in the restructuring of global supply chain after COVID-19. So, as we are very well aware, global supply chains are facing a lot of challenges because of the COVID pandemic. You have to understand when a crisis takes place, and they do take place on a relatively regular basis, although their severity varies, of course. A crisis does not create something new. It exposes the weaknesses of what is existing. And when we look at COVID-19, it is actually a crisis that has been quite, I would say, successful or quite I would say efficient at exposing several of the vulnerabilities of global supply chain. And I try to articulate this, I would say, over four major domains or four major ranges of impact. The first one is pretty much every major supply chain around the world is being restructured, rebalanced as we speak, in terms of the suppliers, the origin, the mode of distribution, the destination, all the way down to e-commerce. So that's one aspect. The second aspect is, we have known that pretty well, supply chains have been tested in terms of their resilience, how efficient they are at handling shocks, and what are the major propagation and backpropagation mechanisms that take place within these supply chains. We are also experiencing repricing of a lot of assets, a lot of resources. What used to be abundant has become scarce, and what used to be scarce has become more abundant. And that's also a very, I would say, interesting development. And the last thing, which is worth also considering, is to what extent COVID-19 is simply a singularity, something new that happens only once, and when it's over, it's simply going to have consequences to which we're going to adjust to. Or is it something which has become, you could say, a new normal? You could even mention if the current pandemic, from an epidemiological perspective, is going to become endemic, and we're going to see a resurgence from time to time and the need for readaptation, and I would say a society which has been transformed by these changes. Of course, I don't have a clear answer to the last point, but this is a question which is worth asking, because if this is something which is singular, you deal with it, but if it's something which is becoming a new normal, you have to, I would say, transform yourself to some kind of a new reality. When we look at supply chains, we obviously look at the supply chain process itself with, you could say, the sourcing, the raw materials, the intermediate phases, manufacturing, assembly, distribution, all the way down to the market. And obviously this is supported by several transportation chains involving container transportation, obviously. The port, which is an important aspect of global supply chain. But there's a whole series or sequences of transportation mode behind this. And when a distribution, you would say a disruption is taking place, it involves a series of shocks depending upon its nature where it takes place. It can be supply shocks, which involve disruption over, let's say, the sources of raw materials, the sources of parts. It could have an impact on the workforce. It could be demand shocks, where you have an impact on the demand itself, that is a change in consumer behavior, changes in consumer preferences, changes in, you could say, the major purchasers of goods. And in between, you have what we call distribution shocks or distribution constraints, which in both cases, the supply shock and the demand shock are also forcing readjustment in terms of the modes, the terminals, and the locations where distribution is taking place. When we have a crisis, it usually involves a single element. I can give you an example. In the United States, when we have a hurricane, it is usually a temporary demand shock, and then the system readjusts itself. But when we deal with pandemics, such as COVID-19, you are dealing with a shock which impacts every single component, from the supply perspective all the way down to the demand, and this at the same time. And this is, I would say, the major challenge that we are facing. And you have seen probably these graphs over and over again, but it is relevant to underline that the pandemic, so far as it takes place, as I would say, has emerged over a series of waves, a sequence, a very specific sequence of events that took place at different rates in different places, and that's also creating a lot of disruptions within the supply chain. We can think about the first wave, which took place in China. Although the severity of the pandemic officially, we don't know what the numbers what numbers really are taking place in China, took place there. And then you saw a second wave, which involved a series of demand shocks around the world, where you saw a series of lockdowns, and that impacted supply chains tremendously. And then afterwards, you start to experience a series of adaptation. That is the growth of e-commerce, new, I would say, adaptation of ports and terminals to new sanitary procedures, new change in demand patterns that you try to cope with. And now we're entering a very disturbing phase, which I call the fourth wave, or the phase of divergence, where things are no longer synchronized. That is, you start to have a resurgence of the pandemic in places such as Europe, and in other places of the world, the pandemic seems to be receding. So wherever you are, you have different forms of effect and demand shocks and supply shocks that are all taking place, but in some kind of asynchronistic fashion, which creates a lot of uncertainties regarding this. So that this chart here represents, again, a synthesis of all these shocks that took place. From the first, the supply shock, which was propagating among supply chain, followed by the demand shock that took place because of lockdowns. And then the third phase was, in a sense, a very uneasy time where you start to adapt and you start to wonder if you should reopen your economy, if you should change the sanitary measures, because you understand very well that there is down the line what we call a deferred demand trap. That is, at some point in time, what happens is what tended to be a temporary crisis could become a depression as your demand patterns has vanished because of, I would say, loss of employment and changes in the manufacturing sector, for instance. So that's something that currently, we are ongoing. We have a lot of different backpropagation mechanism that involves to what extent what used to be a temporary crisis is becoming a recession or even a depression. Speaking of which, when we talk about economic crisis, they are usually unfolding in a series as a sequence, but also they have an impact which varies according to the economic sector. Usually, it is the durable goods sector which has the largest impact because it is the demand where the demand tends to be quite discretionary. So when you have a recession or depression, this is where you observe the largest setback in terms of the demand. While other sectors such as basic goods, of course, with food, in many cases energy, tend to be impacted to a lesser fashion. But there's always some form of disruption, obviously. But speaking of the sequence, and that's also something which is very interesting, a crisis usually takes place as a sequence. That is, you first notice a weakening or some kind of a shock regarding future index, such as transportation rates, such as commodity prices. Then the production sector adapts itself because many people in the industry are now anticipating substantial changes in the market demand, and then they adjust the supply accordingly. And then you start to observe that in trade and container volumes. And those are the last sectors to take place. So there's usually some kind of a lagging effect that takes place. Obviously, with the pandemic that we got with COVID-19, the sequence essentially disappeared. Everything took place almost at the same time, which is, again, something which is quite novel and unusual. Here's an example of what happened in the United States in terms of the impact of the pandemic concerning economic sectors. Most of the sectors that were the most heavily impacted were sectors which were based upon services and discretionary demand, but also services which were highly involved or involving human impacts or human contacts with one another, while the sectors that were freight-related were much less, to some extent, impacted by the supply and demand shock. So that's something you have to bear in mind. There's always, when you have a crisis, a shock, you always have a sequence, and you always have, I would say, discriminatory impact on different economic sectors, and that's what happens in the United States. I would suspect that's what happened to quite a similar way in Korea. And you could expect similar observations across the world. So it's quite relevant when you look at the pandemic to try to compare with the previous one, the previous major crisis that we got, which was in 2008, 2009. And this is what I did. I took a series of indicators, such as the Purchasing Manager Index, and such as the Global Container Throughput Index. Those are well known within the supply chain industry, usually people with oil prices as well. You put them all together, and you notice that when the 2008, 2009 financial crisis took place, there was some kind of a delay effect. There was a sequence of events, and it took many years to recover. Some indicators recovered quite rapidly, some others took a fair amount of time. However, because the COVID-19, as opposed to the financial crisis, is an external shock, it is caused by events which are completely external to the economy in the industry, unlike the financial crisis of 2008, 2009, which was an outcome of internal problems that manifested themselves eventually. COVID-19 was something you could not very effectively predict. It happened, and it affected the industry, which was functioning relatively well. Again, this is subject to debate, depending upon which economies you are looking at. Then this external shock was synchronized. Everybody, everything declined and was impacted at the same time. However, the good news is, since it is an external shock, it may have less opportunities to become internalized. It could disrupt economic system, obviously. It did disrupt many economic systems. That's without any doubt. However, the indicators that we have so far indicate that there is a very sharp bounce back and recovery, which is good news. Again, the concern right now is to what extent this is sustainable. But overall, the major concern is what is external could become internalized within the system. And right now, that's the risk of what could happen. And we could experience a second pullback effect. In that case, if it happens, that will be something which will be similar than, let's say, the 2008, 2009 financial crisis. Again, that remains to be seen. Concerning maritime shipping, that was something quite, I would say, remarkable to observe around the world. Of course, when you compare the number of container vessel calls around the world, when you compare 2020 and 2019, what we have so far, there's been a drop. That's without, again, nobody will disagree with that much. But what is interesting is that The crisis took place at a very unique time in China, which was roughly during Chinese New Year's. And usually when a Chinese New Year's is over, you see a remarkable spike afterwards. That is what happened roughly around here. But then what happened in 2020, you saw a drop in sales. You saw a continuation of, you could say, the depressing effect of the Chinese New Year's. And eventually, as the crisis was absorbed, you saw a recovery. And as of now, the number of port calls, container port calls around the world has somewhat recovered to a level which is a little bit similar to pre-COVID-19. Again, it remains to be seen. We'll see what's going to happen by the end of this year. It's going to be quite revealing as we enter right now the peak commercial season in North America. And shipping lines have been doing this in a very, very different way. When the financial crisis took place in 2008, 2009, immediately the operating margins declined substantially, forcing shipping lines to adopt economies of scale, rationalization, slow steaming, things that we have become familiar with in terms of how the shipping industry react to shocks. And then eventually it recovered, but it was iffy. It took many years of instability. Even with the engine bankruptcy, which of course for the Korean shipping industry was quite damaging, it took place in a time of depressed, I would say, operating margin. Then, by roughly around 2018 and 19, the shipping lines start to embark more and more in capacity management. They were capable of maintaining their rates by adjusting accordingly their capacity. And what is remarkable concerning COVID-19, that under normal circumstances, you would expect a sharp decline in operating margins. It is exactly the opposite that happened. Shipping lines were able to maintain and expand their operating margins. And again, that's remarkable. And the rule of the game is capacity management. We have observed that, for instance, across the Asia-United States shipping route, which is quite important, obviously, for China and Korea. And what we've noticed is the return rate has remained relatively similar, always depressed because of the trade imbalances. However, when the pandemic took place, in April, May, the shipping industry adapted by introducing more and more blank sailings, that is, canceling services, some of them, but also managing their capacity, pushing for economies of scale. Ships that arrive in the United States became bigger and bigger, and it created problems in terminal operations because of that compression. It created phases of high periods of activity, low period of activities, but still the rates increased dramatically. We will see how sustainable this is, but that has been, I would say, a very unique response for the shipping industry. This map is the outcome of a research from my colleagues, Theo Notteboom and Athanasios Pallis and myself. We're currently doing some research about COVID-19 in the shipping industry. And we try to compile around the world, around a series of ports, including Busan, where are the most dramatic changes taking place because of the pandemic. And you see there is no very clear pattern. That's something we found remarkable. That is, it tends to be correlated with if the port is a commercial gateway or not. Tends to be the case. Transshipment hubs tend to be dealing better or doing better, which is good news for Busan. And however, what we found out that there's absolutely no correlation with how the ports were impacted during the financial crisis and how the ports were impacted by COVID-19. We could find any correlation, actually no correlation whatsoever. So that's something we found very, very puzzling. It means there's something else taking place. It is mostly related to what supply chains are concerned, and maybe we're going to find out it's related to specific trade lanes and trade corridors. But at this point, we're still starting to observe how this is unfolding. And the first thing we noticed that there was a similar setback than the financial crisis, but there was no correlation between the financial crisis and COVID-19 in terms of the range or the traffic changes at port. And interestingly, Busan is a port around the world which seems to be doing better than others. In Latin American ports appear to be doing well. Ports in North America are not doing very well during the pandemic, and ports in Europe are the ones who have performed the worst. Again, it mostly linked with the dependency on imports. So it brings us a lot of questions about what's going to happen now in the logistics sector. And that's something which is linked to a series of factors, a lot of uncertainties. One being what's going to happen in the workforce. That is, we are discovering a lot of telecommuting, a lot of online type of work, a lot of online meetings, such as this one. And to what extent the industry, and particularly the logistic industry, is going to adapt to this. Is this going to create automation? That's something which is also quite an issue, because we've noticed a very large substitution during the pandemic to e-commerce. In the United States, Amazon has increased its footprint by roughly 40% more square footage this year in the United States than in 2019, just by Amazon. And of course, it's going to create a push towards automation. The concern for me is what's going to happen if we start to have a cascading defaults in the retail sector. Lots of portfolios, while the retail industry, the tourism industry, the airline industry, many industrial sectors as well are being deeply impacted, and they start to have a lot of layoff, and they start to create a depressing effect on the demand, and it could create a lot of issues, which could create a negative cascading effect, and then what became a temporary shock could become an enduring recession or depression. That again remains to be seen. So meanwhile, obviously we lost a lot of discretionary demand, and we found out that service economies were much more vulnerable than others. So again, that's essentially somewhat my conclusion is, are we dealing with something which is a singularity, or are we dealing with something which is the new normal? And this is going to have a multiple array of impacts concerning economic integration, the manufacturing sector, the transportation sectors, how do we manage transactions? And I wonder, for instance, as far as economic integration is concerned, are we going to see a lot of renegotiation of trade agreement, the re-emergence of protectionism? This is what was already happening in the United States before the pandemic, particularly with China, and that had started to have a significant impact on trade structure. I wonder if this is now going to become, I would say, widespread around the world, particularly since we lost a lot of trust about China and Chinese-related supply chain. What about production? What about automation? And what about a reassessment of the vulnerability of supply chain? In the United States, we realized that we're very vulnerable in terms of medical equipment and the drug industry. That might create changes in terms of the sourcing strategies. We'll see what's going to happen with international transportation and port activities when we might experience a decline of port activity after the current resurgence, after the restocking takes place, after, let's say, the peak season of the United States and the Western world takes place in the fall. What's going to happen afterwards? It remains to be seen. And as far as Korea is concerned, the two questions I'm asking, particularly concerning Busan, which is, of course, a major port. To what extent, because of these changes, Busan could de-anchor its position when export-oriented manufacturing activities start to shift away from China and move to other locations? That could be a very, very big risk. And again, that's full of uncertainty. Busan is a major gateway, of course. Busan is a major transshipment hub linked with the Asia trade across the Pacific, particularly. What would happen when we start to have a lot of decisions made? Okay, we are restructuring all of this. Is it going to involve new platform, new forms of port-centric logistics taking place in other parts of Asia, such as Vietnam, Indonesia, Bangladesh, India, and other parts of South Asia and even Africa? So it's something which is, of course, to be looked at. It is something that needs to be discussed. To what extent all of these changes are going to have an impact on the existing shipping network, on the existing sourcing strategies of supply chain, and obviously on the existing trade lanes around the world. With this said, that's what I had to say for now, and I thank you very much for your attention, and I'm looking forward maybe to receive some questions and discuss the matter further. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Professor Rodrigue has provided much insight and has provided a very sharp analysis of the changes in the economy and logistics after COVID-19. We will now enter into the panel discussion session. I would like to invite Vice President Jong-deog Kim to moderate.
Hello, as introduced, my name is Kim Jong-deog. I'm the Research Vice President of KMI. I'd like to first of all thank everyone for participating despite your busy schedules. We have just heard a keynote speech by Mr. Jean-Paul Rodrigue. It was a very systematic and detailed presentation on the situation faced by the logistic systems in maritime, especially maritime logistics systems in Northeast Asia, focusing on Busan as well. So let's hope. And I think that he has deferred his decision or judgment on whether what we are experiencing right now is a new normal or an event of singularity. So since the corona outbreak in January of this year, we are feeling all the shocks and disruptions to our logistics and also to our daily lives, especially when it comes to automobile industry. The intermediary goods supply has been disrupted, and so we are experiencing the shocks and disruptions that Mr. Rodrigue has been talking about, and we don't know how long this will last. And depending on how long it will continue, we will be very much impacted. And global economic growth is slowing down, and multinational companies are transitioning from offshore to nearshore or onshore, and that has also impacted us as well. And so, even after the coronavirus vaccine has been developed, rebuilding the confidence that we have lost in the logistics system is something that will take quite some time. So in that regard, the keynote speech by Mr. Rodrigue and the panel discussion that we'll be having from now on will be quite meaningful and very timely. We have 5 discussants with us, 4 from Korea and 1 from Japan. And we'll go in this order. Mr. Kim Kye-hwan from KIET, and then Mr. Park Ho-Chul from the Busan Port Authority, and Mr. Kawai Masahiro from Japan, from ERINA, and Professor Sang-joon from Kookmin University, and then Mr. Sung-woo from KMI. I will give all of them 7 minutes each to give their panel presentation. You can talk about the questions that Mr. Rodrigue has presented us with, and also your thoughts on the impact of the coronavirus on the logistics. So, Mr. Kim Kye-hwan, would you like to go first? The floor is yours. Hello. I'm from the KIET. My name is Kim Kye-hwan. Mr. Rodrigue has been talking about the coronavirus, COVID-19, and its impact on the maritime logistics. And he has been talking from a historic point of view, and also the disruptions to the global supply chain in the past, and comparing it to what is happening now, and what kind of response would be most efficient and effective. So thank you for that presentation. And there is a lot of talk about how the coronavirus has been impacting the global supply chain. But we have to take a historical point of view and look at how the global supply chain has been transitioning, has been transforming. Of course, the coronavirus, COVID-19, has had a particularly big shock and disruption on the global supply chain, but that kind of a change has been happening for some time, and the COVID-19 actually accelerated all these transformation and changes. So from the South Korean perspective, from the 1990s, early 1990s, since the new southward policy, I think the changes that are happening right now are of similar size and level. So from that point of view, the rearrangement and rearrangement and restructuring of the logistics system, I think the relationships, bilateral and multilateral relationships in the region and across the world is very, very important in a very important criteria. And so I think there are three things that we have to keep in mind and thinking about in responding to the changes and disruptions in the supply chain. First of all is the southward and westward progression of the global supply chain, with Korean and Taiwanese companies looking for cheaper human labor and moving towards to Southeast Asia. And also we have to keep in mind the technology Cold War between the United States and China. And so the anti or post-China or de-Sinization is something that we have to keep in mind. And thirdly, we have to think about high-tech manufacturing industry and build our industry towards that. So first of all, regarding the southward progression and the westward progression, so many companies in both in Northeast Asia have been looking to Southeast Asia and transferring their production plants to Southeast Asia, and also looking for cheaper human labor in these countries. And that has been accelerated in the COVID era. And then there is the issue of technological Cold War. And this will not be slowed down significantly, even if Biden comes into power. The hegemonic struggle among superpowers for technological hegemony is something that is going to continue to happen. And so the Chinese American decoupling is something that will be inevitable. It will not be as disruptive or complete. This kind of decoupling will not be as complete as during the old Cold War between the United States and Soviet Union, but there will be quite a significant decoupling between China and the United States, and that will open up a lot of options for Korea and also impact Korea quite severely. And then next, what would decide or determine the high-tech manufacturing? What would be the elements that determine the success of high-tech manufacturing? I think R&D will have to be close by, and that will determine the competitiveness of the manufacturing industry. Whether you have R&D capabilities and whether it's physically close by will be a determining factor. So Korean companies going for the high-tech manufacturing industry will have to keep that in mind. And the Korean government will have to build up an ecosystem that has both, that combines R&D with the high-tech manufacturing. And so a reshoring is taking place in order to build up this ecosystem for high-tech manufacturing. So regarding all these changes that are taking place, especially so what should the economy, especially the manufacturing industry, be thinking of? And what kind of strategies should we be engaging in? Let me try to answer that question briefly. I think first of all, we should focus on consulting services and also focus on high-tech manufacturing and also the fourth industrial revolution. Even in Southeast Asian countries, the focus is on the fourth industrial revolution, and they are focusing on building up their high-tech manufacturing industries. And so there is a high demand for consulting services, and I think we are well equipped in Korea to offer those kind of consulting services and leadership. And so there will be a good match. So on one hand, we have to sophisticate our domestic manufacturing industries, and then based on that experience, we should be offering the leadership and services to the Southeast Asian countries and emerging economies that have a great high demand for such high-tech manufacturing services. So, in one word, we can rise to become the high-tech manufacturing platform in Asia. So, moving away from just exporting intermediary goods, we have to be reborn as a much more sophisticated high-tech manufacturing platform that offers both processing and business models and so on. In the 19th century and even throughout the 20th century, building up factories for production and production plants was the core business. But now that kind of role is being absorbed by big cities in the 21st century. And for that big cities to succeed as a high-tech manufacturing platform, I think agglomeration and density is very important. And I think the Busan and Gyeongnam region is well suited to aim for and succeed in this kind of agglomeration and density. Mr. Rodrigue has also talked about how Busan it has been a very central port. And when the focus shifts from China to the to the Southeast Asian countries, then there will be a huge risk or an uncertainty faced by Busan. And I do agree. And I think a good response to this kind of uncertainty would be the strategy to sophisticate our manufacturing industries to become high-tech manufacturing industry and become a platform within the Asian region for high-tech manufacturing. And when I talk about platform, we have students, engineers, and big companies from Southeast Asia coming into Korea. And if they can join joint research with Korean companies, that can happen within Korea. And high-tech manufacturing solutions offered by Koreans that can go into such Korean companies and Korean people can go into Southeast Asian countries to work with the Southeast Asians. So in that way, there will be people-to-people exchanges, business-to-business exchanges, and there will be exchanges of such human resources, infrastructure, and so this what you can call this soft infrastructure. That will be a viable alternative in building up Korea, especially the Busan area, as a high-tech manufacturing platform. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Next, we would like to invite Vice President Park from the Busan Pork Authority. And Professor Rodrigue has raised a direct question to you. Thank you very much, ladies and gentlemen. I am the Vice President for Global Business at Busan Port Authority. We held a VRPC forum last week, and Professor Rodrigue, I recall, took part in discussions then as well. Various developments are taking place, and is it a singularity? Is it a single incident, or is it a new normal? Is it a new way of life for us? I think those are the questions that Professor Rodrigue raised. If I am given more time, I will try to answer those questions. Let me go into my presentation first. The title of this session is The Role of Northeast Asian Maritime Logistics and the strategies for Busan in terms of facilitating logistics amongst Korea, China, Japan, and Russia. So I will go into that topic first, after which I will try to answer Professor Rodrigue's questions. The port of Busan is a central port. When we say central port, what we mean by that is that it is serving as a hub. And the port of Busan is a very pivotal port in Northeast Asia, and it is the world's #2 transshipment hub. I'm sure what I'm saying is true. So to add to that, the port of Busan deals with the sixth largest amount of container cargo in the world, and it is, again, the world's #2 transshipment hub. This supports the global prestige of the port of Busan, and it accounts for 75% of container cargo in the Republic of Korea. So going into the main point of my discussion, in order to maintain such a prestigious status, what are the future tasks for the Busan port in the future? Let me share my thoughts on this. In order to become a hub port, you have to meet about 4 requirements. Of course, they may not be all equally important, but they are very important indeed. And the more you meet these 4 requirements, the more potential of achieving growth. What I'm about to say may be quite unfamiliar to you, but nevertheless, you can kind of link what I say to Starbucks coffee or the airport that you often use. First of all, a port has to be at the center of international trade. The port of Sydney is not very huge on the commercial front. So there is very little possibility that the port of Sydney can become a hub port. So the geological location of a hub becomes very important in that sense. Next, a port, in order to be a hub port, should not have any major competitors surrounding it. The same with a cafe or an airport. What this means is that the port of Busan is being challenged by Qingdao, Shanghai, and so forth, because their ports are being extremely enlarged and they are experiencing rapid growth. And this kind of competition that Busan is facing may be a partial answer to Professor Rodrigue's question. Secondly, having stable global networks with other ports around the world is very important. If you arrive at an international airport, you can go to any other location around the world from there, right? So likewise with ports. Third, the service and productivity of the port is very important. I think that a port has to swiftly receive and dispatch ships. In order for this to happen, and in order for everything to be very swift, you have to have the right kind of personnel and facilities in place, and everything has to be backed up by appropriate government policies as well. Finally, a port has to have price competitiveness. You visit many cafes, and if the service quality is the same, you would naturally opt to go to a cheap cafe, right? So the same can be said for a port. Then, how many requirements does the Port of Busan meet amongst these four elements? Geologically speaking, the Port of Busan covers U.S. When U.S. ship leaves the United States and crosses the Pacific, the first port that it reaches is the Port of Busan. And the Port of Busan is located in the middle of, in between China and Japan. So from a strategic point of view, the location of the Port of Busan is very ideal and optimal. And the second element had to do with global networks, right? According to our recent research, the Port of Busan has the world's number 2 networks, outstanding networks. Rank 1 is Singapore, followed by the Port of Busan. And the third element had to do with services and government policies. The Port of Busan continues to enlarge its infrastructure, and the government and many agencies continue to support this. Therefore, I think the Port of Busan meets the third requirement. And lastly, price competitiveness. This is something that is slightly problematic, I would have to say, quite frankly, because no matter how affordable or good your prices are, if your competitor is providing lower prices, then that could not be very meaningful, right? So overall speaking, I believe that eh, the Port of Busan may have some areas for work. At any rate, I wanted to talk about Korea, Japan, China, and Russia's logistics. Let me add a few comments on that topic. We're located in the East Sea, and this sea links you all the way to North Korea and Vladivostok. These four countries, Korea, Japan, China, and Russia, are joined at the sea, and this is a sea where these four countries' interests collide. But at the same time, it has a geological advantage that makes a win-win strategy possible. Like I said, the Port of Busan is a transshipment hub, so it has to develop a new growth engine. We want Chinese, Northeast Asian, Northeast region for cargo to come all the way to the Port of Busan. From China's point of view, in the Jilin areas and other areas, when they try to outship their cargo, Daeyeon is miles away, but Vladivostok is relatively closer, which is why China could be and may be willing to seek new channels. Under the Putin government, developing the Far East is one of Putin's policy priorities. Therefore, the importance of Vladivostok becomes all the more greater. Next, Japan. Through the northern region and the Siberian region, Japan may be willing to send container cargo to Vladivostok as well and utilize areas like Niigata of Japan. So this is what I mean by how a win-win strategy is possible for all four countries. One challenge that we face is that despite the growth potential, a lot of politics gets involved and interrupts growth and progress. Secondly, we need to ensure policy transparency and openness. Going through the Russian border, going all the way to the EC, oftentimes is not a very facilitated and open channel at the moment. Thirdly, logistics has to go beyond national borders from as I see it. Logistics is a flow of water, is it not? When we talk about a flow of water, it is something very natural, naturally occurring. So logistics has to have efficiency and it pursues lower cost. Yeah, I just wanted to emphasize that. Yeah, I tried to cover various topics all at once in a short period of time. I would like to conclude my remarks with this. Thank you very much.
예, 박단님 감사합니다.
Yes, thank you, Mr. Park. Sorry that I could not give you ample time. I think you can make more comments and also respond to Mr. Rodrigue's question in greater detail during the Q&A or general discussion session. And we have online Mr. Kawai Masahiro from ERINA and the University of Tokyo. Thank you very much for joining us online despite your busy schedule. I'm sorry that I cannot give you more than 7 minutes, so could you please keep your comments to 7 minutes.
Okay, thank you.
네,
very
감사합니다.
much. Thank you very much for inviting me to this very important symposium. I am the representative director of the Economic Research Institute for Northeast Asia, which is located in Niigata, Japan. I want to talk about US-China trade conflict, COVID-19, global and regional supply chains, and trade issues, and the Japanese government's approach. The difficulty is to talk all of these in 7 minutes. First, everybody knows that China, Japan, and Korea have a very close trade relationship with each other. Interdependence is very high. Okay, Japan, Korea have been increasing their trade dependence on China. On the other hand, China's trade dependence on Japan and Korea has not been rising that much, but China has been increasing its economic and trade interdependence with the Belt and Road Initiative countries. Now, US-China trade interdependence has been reduced over the past 2 years or so, mainly because of the Trump administration's approach to China, and also perhaps COVID-19 may have contributed to this declining dependence, a mutual dependence. Now, supply chains have been disrupted, first because of the US-China trade conflict and because of COVID-19. Just I want to show you some data. We know that supply chains have been developing and deepening in China, Japan, Korea, ASEAN, and of course globally. When we take a look at industrial goods trade, And particularly when we take a look at the trade structure of industrial goods by stage of production, we observe some interesting facts. First, China. China used to be a big exporter of consumption goods, but China has been persistently raising the exports of capital goods. And China's parts and components export has been rising also. Today, the export of capital goods is now higher than the export of consumption goods for China. For Japan and ROK, they have been focusing on parts and components. Capital goods export used to be high in Japan, but has been declining as a share. Also, capital goods export for Korea has been declining. And when we take a look at imports of parts and components for industrial goods, for Japan, ROK, and also countries like Germany and the US, we observe that imports from China has been rising very fast. For Japan, Korea, for Germany, the EU is a much more important source of parts and components, but China's weight has been rising. For the US, similarly. More surprisingly, capital goods imports for Japan, Korea, Germany, and the US see a significant increase in capital goods import from China. China, say, for example, in the case of Japan, Japan depends on China for 50% of imports of capital goods. Korea also, Germany, US. So in my view, despite the decoupling issue, the US-China technology conflict, this fact may not change so easily in a drastic way over the next years. Now, logistics is a very important part that supports international trade and economic growth. I take a look at two indicators. First, doing business indicators and the logistic performance indicators, both coming from the World Bank. We know that in terms of doing business indicators, Korea has been persistently a leader, the leader among the CJK in Northeast Asia, and Japan, China, and even Russia have been converging to a relatively high level in terms of doing business. Now, however, when we take a look at the trading across borders indicator, which is one of the 10 indicators that affect doing business indicators, then we observe that Northeast Asian countries are not doing very well. In other words, there's significant room for improvement in trading across borders. Even for Korea, Japan, China, and Russia needs significant effort. And so when we take a look at logistics performance indicators, we know that the Northeast Asian countries are doing well, in particular CJK. Russia has to catch up. But even for Japan, ROK, and China, there are areas where more improvements be needed. For Japan and Korea, international shipments be an area where more efforts could be made. For China, customs is the area. For Russia, a lot of efforts in various parts would be needed. Now, Japan's approach to maritime logistics, trade, and supply chains, the Japanese approach has been to support high-level trade arrangement. Let me talk about logistics policy. Japan has no regional policy for maritime logistics in Northeast Asia, but it joins a trilateral cooperation arrangement with China and Korea, and also it forms 3 bilateral cooperation frameworks with China, Korea, Russia, and also with ASEAN. So Japan tries to work together with the neighboring countries to enhance connectivity, particularly focusing on maritime logistics. The Japanese government published a medium-term and long-term port policy called Port 2030 in July 2018. One of the most important directions of this Port 2030 is to create a marine transport network that supports the global value chain. Japan clearly needs a lot of efficient international ports like Busan. Japan's trade and supply chain policies, Japan has not had clearly defined supply chain policies, but recently Japan introduced one important supply chain policy. Now, in terms of trade, Japanese approach has been to implement high-level FTAs or economic partnership arrangements, which should naturally support supply chains. Japan has been implementing CPTPP, and also together with Korea, China, ASEAN, Japan has been negotiating on RCEP. RCEP is very important for Japan because it covers Japanese multinational companies' supply chains throughout East Asia. And of course, CJK FTA is another important supporting framework for Japan. So Japan introduced a supply chain policy in the most recent supplementary budget for fiscal year 2020. Basically, the intention is to support a shift of production by Japanese companies away from China back to home or to third countries. To home, several companies started to receive subsidies based on this supplementary budget. They basically focus on medical equipment and pharmaceutical manufacturing. So this is largely a response to COVID-19. And then more structural policy, the Japanese government is encouraging diversification of supply sources overseas, rather than simply depending on China, but depending on a wider number of countries, particularly in Southeast Asia and even in South Asia. However, this policy does not mean that Japanese multinational companies are being encouraged to get out of China, but many companies in China will continue to stay in China because of the attractiveness of the Chinese market and also China's ability to produce parts and components and capital goods. Japanese policy is to improve diversification. So let me, because of time, let me conclude. The CJK countries have established a deep trade and economic interdependence, and there is a clear benefit to further strengthening trilateral economic cooperation in logistics, trade, and supply chains, which can contribute to an economic recovery from the negative impact of COVID-19. So improving logistics, particularly for international shipments and customs, be important, and making supply chains less concentrated in single countries and more diversified and thus more resilient to future shocks, and forging RCEP, and we expect the leaders soon to sign RCEP. And hopefully a CJK FTA negotiation will be concluded. But China's role as a major competitive supplier of capital goods and parts and components will likely continue to benefit Japan, ROK, and the rest of the world, even the United States. However, there is a need for the US and China to manage bilateral trade, technology, and strategic conflict to avoid trade disruptive environments. And also, there's a need for the international community to reform the WTO to provide a stable trading framework globally. Thank you very much for your attention.
네, 카와이 소장님 감사합니다. 바쁜 시간 중에 중요한 발표를 해주셔서.
Thank you very much for your wonderful presentation. If you have any question, we will deal with them during the Q&A session. Next, we would like to invite Professor Sang-joon Lee, please. Hello, ladies and gentlemen. I'm very honored to be here with you today. Because of time limits, I would like to pinpoint several of my major points. Before I do that, let me tell you one thing. The Greece civilization, when it was flowering, the Roman civilization was in the peripheries. The same can be said for France and Germany. When France and Germany were at the center, Portugal was at the peripheries. The same can be said for Netherlands and the UK. And when the UK conquered the world, the US was a colony. When the Atlantic ruled, Pacific was a periphery, but we have entered into an era of the Pacific. The greatest change, I think, will come from the Arctic. We are entering into an era bound with changes. Before COVID-19 occurred, the energy supply channel was being restructured. Shale gas was developed by the US and it became a shale export country. And because of climate change, the Arctic ice was melting. And the RNG project was in full force, and LNG has become the focus for Russia as well. Not only were there changes in the energy supply chain, but also in the global value chain as well. In the past, advanced countries thought they couldn't be manufacturers. But what are we witnessing today? They are using technology and become industrial countries. That was what happened with Facebook. If you look at the stocks that are valuable, they are companies like Amazon. So high technology becomes very important in the era we live today. Various new manufacturing centers are emerging today. So when peripheries come to the center, the important thing was to create a road and a channel. The same happened with Rome, Portugal. What I mean by road is a maritime channel. So I think opening maritime channels is very important. If you look at human civilization, they always opened channels and roads. They engaged in trade. And manufacturing happened. And in the process, they thought about how to do things better, which led to innovation. Trade was ensued by manufacturing and innovation. Of course, these three things are happening all at once today. However, in the face of the fourth industrial revolution and changes in the global energy supply chain, in order for Korea to leap forward, Korea has to focus on many things. And Russia is a country that we are focusing on at the moment for many reasons. First of all, it started developing Arctic resources and it wants to open channels to the Arctic. I think the Arctic is significant for two reasons. First of all, up to the 1960s, Singapore was not a major port, but it later became a major port and has grown even larger than the port of Busan. I think that the port of Busan can grow further because if channels open to the Arctic, then Busan can play a very important role. It could serve as a hub port. Russia is trying to export more LNG to Korea. And what made that possible was not only the port capacity of Korea, but because Korea had the capacity to develop high-tech ships that could carry the LNG. They once used Chinese chips, and the ship had exploded, which is why they have more confidence and trust in Korea-manufactured chips. So I think we should focus on Russia's endeavors to develop the Arctic. If strategic material starts to flow, then various assets will also follow. In last year's East Economy Forum, usually they invite Korea, Japan, and China, but the Indian Prime Minister was invited last year, and Prime Minister Abe said that if the energy of the Arctic could cross Japan, then that could go all the way to India. And I think Korea should have a similar mindset. We have to embrace new ways of thinking. Only then will we be able to prepare for the new future. So the Arctic and Korean ports, we have to rethink how those two can be connected. Of course, we already have a well-functioning system in place, but what I'm suggesting is that our systems and channels can be enlarged. And in terms of maritime linkages with Russia, it has a linkage with the Eurasian Railway, and it also has to do with inland channels, inland water channels. So if all of these channels are combined, it could create a huge synergistic effect. So we should also focus on the Najim Port initiative as well. Secondly, because Russia is so focused on the Arctic, we have to remember that it has abundant ecological resources. At the moment, all we are doing is importing from Russia. And I think Russia wants Korea to do more. Russia wants to create higher added value. Instead of merely and simply exchanging items and goods, I think we have to go one step further than that. Even if we have to bring something in and process it, that doesn't mean that our ports will die altogether, because those items will be transshipped from the port of Busan. Because the way we used to do things was so convenient, we have to challenge ourselves. Yes, it has to have a vision of becoming a hub port around the world. The next has to do with the fourth industrial revolution and technological development. The Arctic area is low, has very does, is lowly populated, and it doesn't have much resistance to science and technology. Ever since Putin's fourth term, Russia is really placing importance on science and technology. And Putin is using those words frequently as well, especially words like IoT and robots. And IoT and robots is something that Korea is very good at. And Korean companies are actually seeking areas of cooperation with Russia. Samsung built a center in Russia, and our railroad company is also carrying out a project with Russia. And Hyundai Mobis is creating autonomous vehicles with Russia. So I think, in a similar token, I think the two countries can cooperate in the Arctic area development as well. So I think we should take the most advantage of Busan port. And because we have a manufacturing center as well, I think we can do so much more than opening new channels, but also create added value. If Busan can take the initiative, then this could lead to the advancement, progress, and growth of the Republic of Korea as well. Thank you very much.
네, 교수님
Yes, thank you, Professor Lee. Now moving on to the last discussant, Professor Mr. Lee Sung-woo. Since I'm the last to be last one, I think a lot of my what I wanted to say has been mentioned by my predecessors. So, so first of all, I'd like to thank Mr. Rodrigue for his keynote speech. And I'd like to focus on the comments he made in the last part of his speech on the response required of Busan Port in the post-COVID era. And I think one of the discussants, Mr. Park, has been talking about the capabilities and advantages that Busan Port has. Let me speak from a scholar's point of view. I believe COVID-19 is a crisis, but it's also an opportunity for Busan Port. It will be an opportunity for Busan Port to reshape itself, rebuild itself. And there are 2 points I'd like to emphasize in this regard. First of all, most of the freight cargo owners, they are short of ships. They are facing a shortage of ships to ship their cargo, which is quite strange when the demand has fallen and there is less cargo to ship. Why is there a shortage of ships? And if we look into the causes of this situation, I think that we can get a few ideas. First of all, ships are being remodeled in the process. And so there is a hesitancy. So the ships are available, but they are doing the ship owners are doing spot sales because they don't know when the demand will suddenly fall, and they will be facing a lot of losses. So they are reluctant to bear such risks. So they are being very stringent in supplying ships to cargo owners. So these shippers, they are capable of going to Europe, but then there are not that many ports in Europe, so there is a limitation of shipping capabilities to Europe. And so the shipping costs are continuing to rise for shipments to Europe. And so they have to supply ships that they have to rent ships to supply. But as Mr. Rodrigue has said, they are focusing on shipping line management and ship management. And they want longer lines, and they want to be assured of longer term profits. So what this implies is shippers, they prefer long-term contracts, but then these days they don't. So freight owners, they and people who they are reluctant to take risks, and so so all the stakeholders are reluctant to go for long-term contracts because of the risks. So the government should step in to try to reduce and control these risks and to guarantee and to play the role of guarantor to provide logistics, smooth logistics services. And there has been a lot of talk about the fourth industrial revolution and how COVID-19 has been impacting the logistics system. And so there's been a transition from B2B to B2C. Usually in the ports, the focus was B2B. So, but rather than that, there is a lot of the ports, they can afford to go to from B2B to B2C. So it's a full process where ports can provide services such as even inventory checks and management. So focusing on customer services is something that ports can look at. This is something, an effort that has to be processed domestically. And when it comes to the East Sea region, including China, North Korea, and Japan, there has to be a network, a very close-knit network for the East Sea trade, especially for marine as well as land transport, to provide alternatives for trade routes and transportation routes. And there are political conflicts between all these countries. I think logistics cooperation can help to overcome these political conflicts. So I think in that way, the Busan port can take the lead in offering solutions from the logistics side to overcome political tensions. So that's one thing that we can focus on. And the other thing is not only the near sea trade, but further away to Russia and to Europe. We have to focus on that and the long-term, take a long-term perspective. So port network will be something that we have to look at and focus on at the same time, because we don't have a crystal ball. We don't know whether what we're experiencing now is a singular event or will become the new normal. So we have to prepare both domestically as well as internationally and regionally, and have two-track focuses in responding to the crisis right now. So in that way, I think Busan Port can take the lead in responding in relation to the question that Mr. Rodrigue presented us. Yes, thank you.
늦게
So I think we can use 5 more minutes before we wrap up. So I would like to deal with the questions that were raised by Professor Rodrigue. Vice President Park, I would like to give you 2 minutes to respond to his questions. Professor Rodrigue, I believe, was asking me about how the existing supply chain is all focused on made in China. Made in China means for the US that supply chains are centered in certain areas and that wholesalers and retailers in the US want to diversify supply chains. Professor Rodrigue, you live in New York. I don't think New York has many made in China products. Most of the sportswear and outfits that you are wearing, a lot of them are made in countries like Bangladesh and Vietnam because the global supply chain has shifted to those areas. If China is to supply chains are diversified to other countries, that is not actually good news for the port of Busan. Because from China to the US, you have to transship from Busan. But if the manufacturing hub is diversified to countries like Myanmar and Bangladesh, then the supply chain ports, of course, there are many, and China's ports are one of them, and also the port of Hong Kong and Singapore are possible options as well. So what you pointed out is something that we are also giving much thought to. At any rate, we have to, like I said before, we need to search for new niche markets, and the transshipped cargo, most of it is taken up by Chinese cargo. So if the port of Busan continues to maximize its geological advantages, I think it can increase its volume. If you look at the volume for up to October, as for TS cargo, we're seeing a growth of over 1%. What this means is that the port of Busan is serving relatively well as a transshipment hub. So I appreciate your comments, Professor Rodrigue, and yes, we will continue to give much thought to and focus on the points that you have told us. Thank you very much. Director Kawai Masahiro, if you are still with us online, we would like to ask you a simple question. And if anybody from the floor has a question, I think I can give one person an opportunity to raise their questions. Are you still there, Mr. Kawai?
Yes.
감사합니다. 제가 간단한 질문 하나 좀 드리겠습니다. 이 지금 팬데믹 상황은 우리 동아시아에서도 상당한 의미를 지금 주고 있는 것 같습니다. 혹시 소장님께서 이 팬데믹 상황 하에서 한국과 일본과 한국이 물류 분야에서 어떠한 새로운 협력에 들어갈 수 있을 것인지, 그런 평소에 어떤 생각이 계셨으면 간단하게 개인적인 의견이라도 좋습니다. 좀 소견을 주시면 저희들이 도움이 될 것 같습니다. 부탁드리겠습니다.
Sorry, I did not hear translation.
예, 죄송합니다.
So I did not quite understand the question because I don't understand Hangul.
자, 그럼
Hello.
다시 질문을
Okay, I'll ask the question again. In the pandemic, what kind of cooperation in terms of logistics development can Korea and Japan engage in to respond to the pandemic in the Northeast Asian region?
That's a very important issue. Japan needs to significantly improve port logistics, and this pandemic has made it very important to make the functions of Japanese ports much more efficient. And given the advancement on the part of Korea in maritime logistics, particularly Busan, I think Japan can learn a lot from Busan in terms of improving the efficiency of Japanese maritime logistics. And also Japan and Korea can work together to facilitate much easier movement of people. Now still pandemics restricting the movement of people. The requirement of the testing and self-quarantine requirements are there. And the two countries can come up with a much easier arrangement and at the same time safe arrangement for people's exchanges. So I think there are several things that the two countries can do together to overcome the negative impact of the pandemic.
네, 갑작스러운 질문이었는데 좋은 말씀 주셔서 감사합니다. 그러면
Yes, thank you very much for that very enlightening advice. We will take one question from the audience before we wrap up this session.
Since nobody seems to have a question, I would like to conclude this session now. We have invited 5 distinguished panelists with us. We talked about supply chain restructuring occurring around the world, and we thank you very much for your insight. Changes in the global supply chain is, of course, a trade and economic issue, but it is also linked with political and strategical matters as well, which is why it's not easy for the policies of many countries to be aligned with one another. That in itself creates many challenges and also creates opportunities. Vice President Park talked about a win-win strategy. I hope North Korea can in the future join us and create a win-5 scenario. So, thank you for your comments and for your timely analysis and diagnosis. I hope this can serve as an opportunity to rethink of our policies and initiatives, and I hope we can further link many global chains and channels around the world. I hope that the insights provided today can serve as a springboard for Korea to further develop into a large trading country. Thank you very much for your attention, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you for the insightful discussions and presentations. I would love to give you more time, but unfortunately I cannot. Once again, I would like to thank the moderator and the discussants for your participation. Please give them a big hand. Thank you very much. We will conclude the morning session with this and move to the luncheon hall. Distinguished guests, please remember to take your meal tickets and enjoy your lunch at the Westin Joseon Hotel. Those of you who have not received meal tickets, please come to the registration desk in the lobby area. We are holding the Voice of Peace exhibition in floor 1. We ask for your interest. We will resume session 4 at 2 o'clock sharp in the afternoon. Secretary General Lee Hyuk, Ambassador Lung En Putung, Executive Director Jasmine Lee will join us for the